Hello, I'm Robert Labarge, and this is my Gilded Age project. In this project, I was asked to answer the 4 questions and relate them back to real-life events. In what ways did government help or hinder business growth during the Gilded Age? In what ways did government and business promote or prevent immigration during the Gilded Age? Explain the relationship between business and labor and how that relationship has affected both groups. And how did immigration socially and politically affect American cities? I will be showing my sources at the end of the podcast in case you are wondering, and they will also be in the description of the YouTube video. The first question is, in what ways did government help or hinder business growth during the Gilded Age? And I think this question is in the right direction, but I think it actually should be, in what ways did business affect the government? Because government didn't really affect business. It was the other way around, because the government just couldn't keep up with the speed of the way that business was changing. The government also used social Darwinism, basically putting the laws of the origin of species and natural selection up for how social interactions work. Like, they will just phase out and they'll equalize if they are poor decisions. And they also use laissez-faire, which means to let be, and it basically means that the government shouldn't step in to business transactions. And these two principles led to very extreme effects for the poorer side of America. Business was able to do what it wanted. They used a bunch of shady tactics like vertical integration and horizontal integration. Vertical integration being the use of one company controlling all the means of production to cut out a middleman, and horizontal integration, which is the sketchier one, being one company using multiple different companies under different names to produce things for that company for a lot cheaper. Now, horizontal integration wasn't good because it made it so that companies could monopolize the market and have a complete control over the goods that they put out. They also used things like trusts. Trusts were bad for the economy because it meant that one person could lend out their business to a bunch of other people and spread out its influence unfairly, but also not have to treat it like it was one large business but a bunch of smaller businesses. With the creation of these monopolies, the businesses can essentially charge whatever they want for their goods. And when that happens, it means that the consumer will suffer and the economy will in turn suffer. Now, a real-life example of these monopolies in today's society would have to be EpiPens, and the fact that they can now charge as much as they want for an essentially very cheap drug, epinephrine, because they've copyrighted the injector, and it is the most stable injector in the market, so people are forced to buy $600 products that are only worth about $10 in materials. A good example of the use of all of these comes from John Rockefeller. Rockefeller was very prominent in the oil business, and he had a monopoly over his regional area. Because Rockefeller had a monopoly, he was able to capitalize on the fact that the railroads needed to ship oil to him, and so he could offer them incredibly low rates that if they did not accept, they would go out of business for. This is a good example of not only a monopoly, but also horizontal integration, because it shows how he was able to manipulate and use other businesses to work for him for cheaper than advertised. The second big way that business affected government was through the use of political machines. These political machines were basically large political organizations that existed solely for the profit of the people in charge. For an example, Tammany Hall was a very large political machine, and it was run by a man who they called Boss Tweed. They helped the Irish immigrants, and they used their votes to rise to power. And then there were also scandals of them doing things that would be considered now insider trading, such as buying land that was going to go to government facilities and then selling it to the government for a markup. These political machines basically just kind of sucked money off of the government through alternative means, like buying resources that the government needed, that they knew the government needed, and then selling them back to the government at a markup. And they basically just served as a middleman for the government, which overall hurt the ability for the government to actually do its job correctly, which is sort of like the corruption that business put into the government during the Gilded Age. The second question is, in what ways did government and business promote or prevent immigration during the Gilded Age? Government is a two-sided blade. On one hand, political machines such as Tammany Hall rely heavily on immigrants and thus would want immigration to be a major part of society. However, the political opponents of these machines would usually be opposed to immigration in order to control the base of supporters. We see this with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was put forward in the late 1800s in order to limit Chinese immigrants to America, but mostly to California, in order to maintain the correct ratios for voters. This is similar today in the way that immigration is being talked about in the current state of America. The Republican Party generally wants less immigration for protection of jobs, but also because the Democratic Party appeals more to immigrants, and if immigrants were allowed to vote and let into the country more frequently, that would mean that the Democratic Party would have more support and the Republican Party would have less. These conflicting political beliefs are the main reason why immigration is talked about so heavily in America. Because neither side wants to meet halfway in the middle, it becomes a very heated topic. On the other hand, business during the Gilded Age was mostly for immigration. This is because it was a source of cheap, unskilled labor that could be exploited by rich individuals and large companies. Carnegie is a very good example of this. Carnegie lowered wages for his steel mill workers in order to get them out of the facility and on strike. Once they left the facility, Carnegie had his assistant Henry Clay Frick surround the facility with barbed wire and make it so that none of the workers could enter the facility. He then had private security inside of the facility to make sure that none of the workers got in. However, the workers got word that they were being replaced, so they ended up storming the facility and getting into a major altercation with the security guards. These were regarded as the Homestead-Strikes and saw many people killed and injured throughout the duration of the conflicts. The reason that the workers got to this point is because they heard that they were being replaced with workers who were immigrants. The fact that they were immigrants actually segues very nicely into the next two questions. The first of which being, explain the relationship between business and labor and how the relationship affected both groups. Generally, when laborers were treated badly, they attempted to form unions. Unions were groups of laborers that were banded together to negotiate with the employers so that they could have more rights or more pay, basically to even out any inequalities at the job. One of the first labor unions was the Knights of Labor. They were popular because they offered people protection during a time of economic uncertainty, and they were also large enough to effectively pressure companies through strikes. Most famously, they did the railway strike of 1877, where they were able to shut down B&O Railroad for months in order to get a strike going that gave the workers more rights. There was also the American Federation of Labor, which was an organization that was set up later on, and it stemmed from the fact that the Knights of Labor excluded many groups from its labor unions. So the American Federation of Labor was built to work off of the shortcomings of the Knights of Labor and continue onwards. Even though labor unions existed, it still did not guarantee that the workers would get any rights. As we saw before, Carnegie replaced all of his workers with immigrants who were not part of a labor union in order to save money. The business owners ultimately had the decision on whether or not they hired people, so they could fire people in unions and hire people who were not in them, and that's where the general lack of power from the union comes from. This fear of the employers replacing workers is still prevalent today. However, it's not in the form of immigration anymore. It is actually in the form of technology and automation replacing jobs. A good example of this is an article by the New York Times that showed that Amazon employees were going on strike during Black Friday because they couldn't keep up with the speed that the machines wanted them to work at. Now, eventually, Amazon will replace these workers with robots. It is just a matter of time. And that is happening across the United States because robots are cheaper than laborers. So eventually, unions will end up losing to automation. This is not a good thing, and it's a very scary concept because it means that jobs are going to be disappearing and there's going to be less say of the general public and less ways for people who are of lower income to make money efficiently. The fourth and final question is, how did immigration socially and politically affect American cities? Politically, it affected American cities because immigrants were citizens. Being citizens, they had the ability to vote. Thus, immigrants were able to change the polls and affect the political climate. Political machines such as Tammany Hall relied heavily on the votes from immigrants to make sure that they were afloat. Immigrants were good sources for votes because they all came from the same place, had a similar culture, and similar beliefs. Socially, immigrants had a different impact on cities. Many of the places immigrants were forced to live in were extremely deplorable and low in terms of living conditions. There was actually a movement during the Gilded era to bring more rights to immigrant communities. People called muckrakers would go into the immigrant communities, take pictures, and present slideshows for rich and wealthy people who may invest in improving the lives of the immigrants. Muckrakers were extremely important because the news would often censor anything regarding immigrants as being inappropriate or not fit for the news. Immigrants were actually split into two categories: old immigrants and new immigrants. Old immigrants arrived from 1800 to 1880 and were usually of Western European descent. New immigrants usually arrived from 1880 to 1915 and were usually of Southern and Eastern European descent, as well as Chinese. Very similar to today, the old immigrants were afraid of the new immigrants and brought up the fact that there would be a lack of labor if the new immigrants came and took jobs because they were not part of unions. These fears led to shifts in the groups of voters, which also led to acts like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred all Chinese from entering the United States. We also see the tolerances for immigrants being shortened and taken down, as in it was a lot harder to get into the United States from at the end of the Gilded Age than it was at the beginning. This is exemplified with the extra steps added on to the process of immigration through port cities like Ellis Island. These ports are an example of the new immigrants being barred out, whereas the old immigrants were let in more freely. The old immigrants would generally not want the new immigrants into the country, and that was because they were against the prospect of losing jobs, as well as the fact that they were also slightly racially biased, wanting to guarantee that their race would continue to live and thrive in America, and they would not be outpopulated by the newer immigrants. This topic of immigration continues to be a hot topic in America to this day. There have been many political discussions about whether or not immigration is harmful or helpful to the United States, and it still remains to be seen. The two main political parties, Republicans and Democrats, can still not agree on what immigration is acceptable and how it should be done. That's going to do it for this podcast. All of the sources are right here, and there will be all of the sources in the description below. Thank you. Have a nice day.